So this is a problem that we've sort of self-created. Humans are the only species smart enough to invent their own food and dumb enough to eat it. We have created this problem with our modern food environment, but that also gives us an opportunity, because that means that we can undo it. We can fix it. We just need to address that same food environment that has caused this issue to start with.
Welcome to Healthcare Liberty Labs with Tiffany Ryder, where we teach you what they don't want you to know about healthcare.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're looking to avoid not just an early death, but also the years and often decades of dealing with chronic disease that was essentially preventable, then today's episode is for you. There's a lot of talk in the media, on your social feeds, at work, about metabolic health and GLPs or obesity, heart disease, all of these things, but there isn't a lot of clear-cut information on what tests you should be asking your doctor for, what data you should be actually concerned about, and what to do about it when the numbers come back and they aren't favorable. And that's exactly what we cover here today. Today's conversation is between Andy Schoonover, CEO of Crowd Health, and Dr. Ovadia. Dr. Ovadia is a cardiothoracic surgeon and also the author of Stay Off of My Operating Table. He is one of the few surgeons who is jumping up and down, preaching good science around preventative health and essentially trying to work himself out of a job. So if chronic disease is something that you are concerned about, if you realize that only 12% of Americans are considered metabolically healthy, and you want to make sure that you're in that group and that that group is growing, today's episode is absolutely for you. So check it out. Let me know what you think.
Dr. Ovadia, welcome.
Great to be here with you, Andy.
Thanks for coming. Really, I've been following you for a while, and I love what you're about. You know, not only one of the leading, cardiac surgeons in this country, but also one of the few in healthcare that if you really accomplish your mission, you're going to put yourself out of business, which I love. We have so many rent seekers in healthcare, and you're one that's like, hey, if I do this well, if I accomplish my mission, I'm not going to have much work. What is your why behind that?
Well, quite frankly, that is the why. And I know it doesn't make me a very good business person. But, what I have come to realize now, having been a heart surgeon for over 20 years, is that the vast majority of what I do shouldn't be needed. I feel blessed every day that I can offer that to the people who were there and the people who do need it at that time. But for the vast majority of them, like I mentioned, they shouldn't have gotten to this point. And we should be addressing these issues prior to them ending up on my operating table. So, through the combination of my personal and professional experience, it has led me to a point where I realized that my mission is really to keep people off my operating table and to spread the information that can help to keep people off my operating table. And if ultimately that leaves me with nothing to do as a heart surgeon, I will feel very fulfilled because I know we will have made a major, major impact on people's health.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, when you think of how many people you can keep off the operating table, I mean, cardiovascular disease is what, the number one killer right now in terms of the number of people who die per year. Is number one is cardiovascular disease. What percentage of those, if we do what you're telling us to do, which, here's the book, we're going to talk about this in just a little bit, but if these folks do what you say we should do, what percentage can we keep from having heart attacks, staying off your operating table, and most importantly, keeping them alive?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, heart disease is the number one killer far and away in the United States and worldwide. And here in the US, it's been the number one killer for each of the last 70 years. So, it's not going anywhere. When you look at heart disease, The most common form of that is what we call atherosclerosis, buildup of blockages in the arteries. And this causes people to have heart attacks. This causes heart failure, and ends up contributing to people's deaths in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm.
It seems from the studies that metabolic health, insulin resistance specifically, is a major contributor to the incidence of atherosclerotic heart disease. There was a very prominent researcher by the name of Dr. Gerald Reaven, who did his work really during the 70s and the 80s into the 90s. And, he said that basically the patient with atherosclerotic heart disease that are not diabetic just haven't been diagnosed properly. And essentially what he was saying and what his data, what his research shows is that almost every patient with atherosclerosis is insulin resistant. Perhaps the one thing that we can point to outside of that would be smoking. And there are some other, factors that go into it, but almost every patient with atherosclerosis is insulin resistant. And therefore, I believe that if we were to address that true root cause of insulin resistance early, we could prevent the vast majority of the cases of atherosclerosis and the deaths from atherosclerosis. So, when you look at the number of people that end up on my operating table, I truly believe that 90% of them could be prevented from being there in the first place if we were to address the underlying root cause of their disease.
Why do you think insulin resistance just is not on people's radar screen? I mean, for the vast majority of the public, and even me before getting into my current position as CEO of Crowd Health, never really thought about insulin resistance. Like, why is this something that the general population just doesn't know about? I mean, I know about blood sugars. I know that high blood sugars is not good, especially over a sustained period of time. But insulin, to me, historically has been, oh, thank God for insulin because it keeps our blood sugars down. Why has this not been a focus of kind of the general population to date?
Yeah, it's not a focus of the general population because it's not a focus of the healthcare system and the healthcare practitioners. We really aren't trained to think about insulin resistance. Very much in line with what you said, doctors diagnose high blood sugar. They diagnose people with diabetes, which is, what high blood sugar is. They don't diagnose insulin resistance. We don't test for it. We don't understand it. And, we're not educated about it. It's one of those things that, yeah, it's in our textbook. And, we probably had some discussions, during medical school about, the physiology of it. Although, to be honest, I don't specifically really remember ever discussing insulin resistance. But, certainly in day-to-day practice, it does not come up, and it's not something that's talked about, at the medical conferences. It's not something that's as widely researched and published about as it should be. And it's just not emphasized in the medical system. We could talk about why that might be. And, the big answer that I would give is that we don't have a simple treatment for it. We don't have a medication that directly addresses insulin resistance. And therefore, we don't talk about it like some of the other things that have become, that do dominate the discussions around, chronic diseases and things like heart disease.
One of the things that I read about insulin, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're the doctor here, but as I was doing some work on just understanding insulin, the how our body uses insulin. If you look back thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, the whole point of insulin was not necessarily to lower your blood sugar. It was to take that sugar in your blood and to store it as fat for later, because if you had really high blood sugar back in the days, that you probably are going to go a sustained period of times without having any kind of food. And so you needed a mechanism in your body to capture that blood sugar, store it as fat. And so you have something later. I mean, is that right or is that wrong? And it's just so interesting to me if that is correct, how we've totally changed the whole point of insulin because of our modern day diet.
Yeah, so you're correct really on both things you mentioned there. So insulin is essential to life. Without insulin, and insulin is a hormone that our body makes. Without insulin, we die. So that's basically what type 1 diabetes is. Type 1 diabetes means that you can no longer make insulin. And again, before we were able to artificially produce insulin or synthesize insulin, outside of our bodies and then be able to administer it as a drug, type 1 diabetes was a fatal disease. And it was a wasting disease. Basically, patients could not add fat and they would just waste away and ultimately die because, as you said, they couldn't store energy. And that's what basically insulin allows us to do. It allows us to store energy. And historically, energy, from food, which is the primary source of our energy, was difficult to come by. So there would be periods of time where we didn't have food readily available. And our bodies needed to evolve a mechanism to deal with that. What has happened in our modern food environment, we've essentially eliminated that problem, which on the one hand is certainly good. A lot less people starve to death today than they did hundreds and thousands of years ago. But we've created a new problem in that we've broken that insulin system, and we now stimulate our bodies to store so much excess energy that basically our bodies say, we're not taking any more storage. And that's what insulin resistance is. And now that excess energy starts to build up in the system, in the form of glucose, also, in other ways. And that now is causing end organ damage, things like damage to our blood vessels, which is ultimately what leads to atherosclerotic heart disease, the condition that we started talking about. So this is a problem that we've sort of self-created. One of my favorite sayings is that humans are the only species smart enough to invent their own food and dumb enough to eat it, because we have created this problem with our modern food environment. But that also gives us an opportunity, because that means that we can undo it. We can fix it. We just need to address that same food environment that has caused this issue to start with.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about a couple of the foods that you point out in your book that you say to stay away from that I love. So we're going to talk about those in a bit. But I do want to talk about your book, Staying Off My Operating Table, which I think you'll see here, which, I love this book for a couple of reasons. One, it is what others want to say in 10,000 words. You've been able to put in little increments of 1,000 words, which I love that. It's totally digestible. I feel like I understand metabolic health after reading your book. It's about 130, 140 pages with some FAQs at the end. You can get through it in a couple sittings. And I mean, I think this is an incredible, asset that we're actually going to provide to our members at Crowd Health for free if they want one. So I like it that much. One of the things you talked about are, you have 12 myths in your book. And I wanted to go through, a few of them, and I tried to pick out 4, but I went through 12 and I was like, man, I really want to dive deeper into all 12 of these. But I have a couple that I'd love to run by you.
Sure.
Well, the myth, I think it was number 1, is only obese people are metabolically unhealthy. And we're going to go through my labs later, and you're probably going to tell me I'm one of those people. But explain that to me, because typically what you would think is you look at somebody who is skinny and you say, okay, that person is healthy. You look at somebody who is obese and you say that person is unhealthy metabolically. Why is this a myth? Only obese people are metabolically unhealthy.
Yeah, so there's plenty of data that shows us that this is a myth, first of all. And one of the more recent studies was a study looking at what's called the NHANES data from 2016. It's a national survey of people's health, nurses specifically, that has been going on for 40 or 50 years now. And they track people's health over time, and they look at various aspects of it. And when they surveyed the 2016 data to look at the components of metabolic health, what they found was that 88% of the adults in the United States, of the adults in that survey at least, were not in optimal metabolic health. Shocking statistic. Only 12% of us can meet the standards of metabolic health. But then, when they went and they broke down the categories in that study, looking at weight categories, so they broke people down into, obese, overweight, normal weight, and underweight. And, as you would expect in the obese category, almost everyone was metabolically unhealthy, although not everyone. I believe it was about 2 or 3% that were what we call metabolically healthy obese. But, when you look at the normal weight category, 50% of those people were still metabolically unhealthy. So yes, being normal weight gives you a better chance of being metabolically unhealthy, of being metabolically healthy, but it in no way guarantees that you're metabolically healthy. It's basically a 50-50 shot, here in the US. So that's why, we get fooled by that concept that just weight is an important determinant of health. And again, we've seen this in study after study, that weight is a pretty poor marker for overall health. And you can make the mistake in both directions. Again, practically, what I see every day is, I do operate on a lot of people who are not obese, and they still end up with advanced heart disease. So this is why you really have to get to the root. You really have to be looking at your metabolic health specifically. And again, we'll go into some more details about what that is and how you do it. But you can't make the assumption that just because you're not obese, that you're healthy and you're doing fine.
Well, you do lay out, I think, 4 or 5, I can't remember, points or metrics that say, hey, if you have, you can explain to us, but 2 or 3 of these, then you should really be paying attention. So can you go through those real quick, just so the listeners can do in their minds, or some of them are in minds, some of them might have to look at the data, but kind of assess themselves whether they're metabolically healthy?
Yeah. So, these are the 5 basic metrics that we use to assess metabolic health. And everyone really does need to know these numbers. So the first one you can measure at home, and it's your waist circumference. You just take a tape measure, you measure just above the level of your belly button. Best to do this first thing in the morning. And if you're a man, you want that to be less than 40 inches. If you're a woman, you want that to be less than 35 inches. And I'm going to caution as I go through these numbers that I think even some of these numbers, the cutoffs are too generous, and really ideal looks, maybe even different than some of these numbers. But these are the official metrics. These are the metrics that were used in that study to show that 88% couldn't meet all 5 of these metrics. Metric number 2 is going to be your blood pressure. And in order to be defined as metabolically healthy, your blood pressure should be less than 130/85. So both of those numbers need to be below those cutoffs, and that needs to be without the use of medications. High blood pressure is actually one of the early signs of metabolic health problems, and it should be recognized as such. But unfortunately, you go to your doctor, you get diagnosed with high blood pressure. They say, no worries, we have a medication for that. They put you on the medication, and they don't think about the underlying cause of that high blood pressure. And that, again, leads to problems down the line. So those 2 metrics, really, you could measure both of those at home. Very easy to get a home blood pressure cuff, or, any grocery store or pharmacy these days has the blood pressure kiosk.
And those are 30 or 40 bucks, right? I mean, you go to Amazon and get a blood pressure cup for 30 or 40
even
bucks.
cheaper than that.
Even cheaper than that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So easy enough to track at home. And then the other three are basic blood work. And, this is blood work that almost every doctor is going to do, as part of a routine exam. The issue becomes that doctors may not look at it in this context. So they may miss some of the signals that are there. We look at your fasting blood glucose level. So the amount of sugar that's not in your blood, if you have, and you shouldn't have eaten for about 8 to 12 hours, and that should be less than 100 milligrams per deciliter, which is the units here in the US. And again, without the use of medication. Type 2 diabetes, one of the hallmarks of metabolic health, of poor metabolic health. So, if you've been diagnosed with that, that's another indicator that you're not metabolically healthy. And then we do look at your cholesterol panel, but importantly, we don't look at the number that your doctor is most likely to focus on, the
bad one, the LDL,
the so-called bad cholesterol. Instead, we look at two other numbers from that panel. We look at your HDL cholesterol. And, again, most people are going to call this good cholesterol. Not a big fan of those nicknames, but that's how most people understand it. The reason we call it good cholesterol is because we do actually want this to be higher. And, that confuses some people because all they hear their whole life is your cholesterol needs to be lower. But your HDL cholesterol, you want it to be higher. And if you're a man, you want it to be over 40 milligrams per deciliter. If you're a woman, you want it to be over 50 milligrams per deciliter. And then finally, we look at the triglyceride level. And this you want to be lower, and you want that to be less than 150 milligrams per deciliter. So you look at those 5 metrics. If 3 or more of those are abnormal or are not in that healthy range, that actually diagnoses you with what we call the metabolic syndrome. It's a medical diagnosis, and it means that you are at very high risk of most of the chronic diseases that we suffer from in society today. Things like heart disease, things like Alzheimer's disease, many forms of cancer. You can go down and down the list. And it turns out that probably 8 of the top 10 causes of death every year in the US are associated with the metabolic syndrome and poor metabolic health. If 1 or 2 of those are outside the healthy range, that's your warning sign, because that means that you're on your way to the metabolic syndrome and you need to start making some changes so that you don't end up getting there. And then, like I said, if all 5 are in range, congratulations, that's about 12% of the population, probably less than that these days, to be honest, can meet all 5 measures of optimal metabolic health.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about it in a little bit. I think I'm 2 of the 5 are no good for me, so I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. I do want to get onto the second myth, which gets into I know I rail a lot on this in social media, but it is the food pyramid. I think your second myth is the food pyramid is good for you. I'd love to get your thoughts on the food pyramid, nutrition in general, because my assumption is that nutrition is one of the primary ways of driving better metabolic health. So what happened here? Like why did this food pyramid come about, and why has it been such a disaster? Or maybe I should be open-ended. Is it a disaster?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think we need to be open-ended or ask that question, because we can just look all around us. The food pyramid in its various forms have been the prevailing nutritional recommendations here in the US since 1980, so 40 plus years. And during that time, our health by every metric has gotten significantly worse. And the very problem that the food pyramid was designed or the food guidelines were designed to tackle, the obesity problem and the problem of heart disease, have gotten worse during the time that they have been in circulation. Now, the proponents of the food pyramid of the US dietary guidelines will tell you that's because people don't follow the recommendations. But again, we have the data that shows that our consumption, our food consumption, as on a nationwide level, has moved in line with the US dietary guidelines. We have significantly lowered our intake of fat over the past 40 years. We have lowered our intake of saturated fat and red meat over the past 40 years. And we have increased our consumption of grains, specifically those whole grains that they tell us are so healthy for us. And our health has only worsened during that time. So that's why you need to step back and start to say, something must not be right. Where did we go wrong? And you really have to go back to the genesis of the US dietary guidelines. And that story, goes back to the 1950s, when we started to notice an alarming increase in the incidence of heart disease. Again, like I said, it's been the number one killer in the US since the 1950s. If you go back further to the early 1900s, heart disease is almost undescribed and unheard of. We have reports from the leading physicians, in the US in the late 1800s and the early 1900s of the types of cases that they would encounter, during their careers, during their practice. And many of them would rarely, if ever, see cases of heart disease in the 1900s. So it seems that heart disease was, a very rare condition in the early 1900s. And then throughout the early 1900s, it starts to increase. And 1950, it really reaches, what's considered epidemic proportions. And what specifically set off the alarm bells is the president of the United States has a heart attack while he is in office. And again, this sets off the alarm bells. And so people rightly start asking what's causing this heart disease. And there were basically two prevailing theories at the time. The scientists of the day, were actively researching this, and their theories fall into one of two camps. One camp was that it was dietary fat, specifically saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, that was causing this. And the other was that it was sugar, dietary sugar. And, for various reasons that we can get into at some point, the fat theory won out. And what came to be known as the diet heart hypothesis became the prevailing hypothesis about what was causing, heart disease to be rampant. And so we then started to try and figure out ways to lower the amount of fat in the diet, lower the amount of saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet. And that culminated, with there was a congressional committee that looked at this, and eventually it led to the U.S. dietary guidelines, which were first released in 1980 and have then been revised every 5 years since. And most of those revisions were to, because it was recognized that it wasn't having the effect that it was intended to affect. Most of those revisions of the guidelines then became, well, we must need to, do this better. We must need to lower the fat threshold even more. And that's had a number of, what you could say are unintended consequences. But it basically created this processed food environment because, natural foods, for the most part, are not low fat. And there's probably very good reasons for that. So in order to make low fat foods, you have to process them. You have to take the fat out. And if you're going to take the fat out, you have to replace it with something. And that something becomes sugar and carbohydrates. And, that is what has led to our insulin resistance problem, which has then led us to this, now even worse environment of chronic disease.
Well, I mean, you can even go down the candy aisle, right? And the candy, on the package, it says right there, fat free. It's just marketing ploy to say, hey, fat free is the way to go. Whereas you're having a Snickers or a Twizzlers or something like that, which is vastly more impactful to your metabolic health than, you know, a steak, which is clearly full of fat, which is crazy. Which, so it kind of leads to the next myth that I pointed out. I think it was your myth number four or five, but it's low carb is bad for your health. So yeah, funny story is I went into a cardiologist maybe a month or two ago, and he said, so, you know, I saw your cholesterol is super high, so tell me about your diet. And I said, well, I'm doing keto, have for the last 6 or 9 months. He's like, oh, well, you know that red meat is inflammatory. You know that your high cholesterol is going to create, I forget, he said, plaque in your arteries, and you're at a high risk of a heart attack. And I knew, listening to you, that, you know, neither one of those things were true, but it's still probably a product of not being, which maybe a product of two things. One, not being trained in nutrition, but even if they were trained in nutrition, they would probably be trained on the wrong stuff, because we still have an establishment healthcare, you know, industrial complex that is pushing this idea that, you know, low carb is bad for your health. So we can, you know, get statins in you and all these kinds of things. So would love to hear more about kind of the low carb is bad for your health myth.
Yeah. So, you know, what you encountered is the typical experience that people have when they discuss these issues with their doctors. And like I said, you know, I'm not blaming the physicians. I'm blaming the system that they're in and the education that they receive. And again, this concept that low carbohydrate diets, ketogenic diets, you know, are harmful for your health is based solely on this concern about cholesterol, and specifically about our LDL cholesterol levels. And again, it really has no basis in science. There is no study that I'm aware of that shows increased incidence of heart disease in people doing low carbohydrate diets. And realize that, you know, while low carbohydrate diets have become, you know, very popular recently within the past 5 to 10 years, you know, we have a history around low carbohydrate diets, you know, that goes back a long time. In fact, our evolutionary diet was probably low carbohydrate. But, you know, low carbohydrate diets as a therapeutic tool was first suggested in the late 1800s. And again, we go back to type 1 diabetes. And before the synthesis of insulin, the only therapeutic treatment that was available for type 1 diabetics was to stop feeding them carbohydrates. And, you know, it would slow the progression of the disease. So we've had low carbohydrate diets for a long time. You know, Atkins was, you know, a popular one during the you know, 70s and 80s. There have been many other forms of low carbohydrate diets. So, you know, you would think that we would have scientific data showing, you know, this immense threat to our heart disease that it's supposed to be, if that was in fact true. And the reality is you can't find that data. It doesn't exist because it's simply a hypothesis, and it really doesn't hold up. What low carbohydrate diets actually do is they are one of the most powerful tools for reversing insulin resistance. And as I said, insulin resistance is the biggest risk factor for heart disease. So even if we take everything at face value, you know, if we take the risk that's been associated with LDL cholesterol as it, you know, turns to heart disease, and we recognize that the risk that's associated with insulin resistance is much, much higher, on the order of 6 to 10 times as powerful a risk factor. If a dietary strategy is reversing insulin resistance, even if it is raising your LDL cholesterol, which is an inconsistent occurrence, but even if it were to raise LDL cholesterol in all of those people, at the same time reversing their insulin resistance, you're still going to have a net benefit when it comes to heart disease. So, you know, quite frankly, this is really fueled by the forces that don't want people, on low carbohydrate diets. This is basically, the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and this is the only narrative that they can use against low carbohydrate diets. I have no reservation whatsoever in recommending low carbohydrate diets for my patients with established heart disease. And I certainly have no reservations in people that don't have established heart disease, even if it makes even if they see a rise in their LDL cholesterol.
So is this malicious intent, ignorance, or both?
Well, I probably a little bit of both. I think for the most part, it's ignorance. When you look at the physicians, it's just, as I said, it's the way they've been educated and the system that they're in. There certainly is, at an institutional level, I guess we could say, there's reasons that the established institutions don't want people to recognize the effects that what they are eating are having on their health. And really, I think that's what it comes down to. Because if we really centered that discussion around health on the food that we were eating, we would have a vastly different environment. We would cause vast changes in the market for food. And obviously there are, well-established business interests that are doing just great with our current environment, our current food environment, that really don't want that to change.
Well, statins, from everything I've read, is probably the most profitable drug ever made. And so there are lots of interests that are keeping statins as the response to high cholesterol. The elimination of high cholesterol being an issue is elimination of a lot of dollars. So, there's some saying, and I always mess it up, but it's like, it's hard to convince somebody of something that's going to take food off of their table, right? Like, it's going to be hard to convince pharmaceutical companies that this is not, an effective way of addressing high LDL, or even that high LDL may not be actually an issue. So I kind of want to go back to, and we're going to go in first full circle here, but you kept mentioning insulin, and I want to go back, and I think I'd love to understand. Insulin feels a bit like a frenemy. It's a friend because without it we would die. But you also said that the resistance to it is the number one kind of indicator of potential heart risk, heart disease. So can you just explain that to, like, physiologically, what is going on inside of us that insulin resistance is going to be the number one issue? It's kind of the canary in the coal mine, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. And, so to go back, like we talked about earlier, the primary role of insulin is to allow our bodies to store energy and to get sugar out of our bloodstream. So, one thing that we didn't mention earlier is that sugar is toxic. And above certain levels in our bloodstream, sugar is toxic. It starts to damage our blood vessels. It starts to have other damaging effects on some of our other organs. So our body needs a way to get it out of the bloodstream. And again, that's one of the primary roles of insulin. What happens is, over time, as we're consuming more and more sugar, and all of the carbohydrates that we eat are broken down to sugar in our body. And as we bring more and more sugar into the system, and the body has to find a way of disposing of this sugar, we make more and more insulin. And, that insulin then causes that sugar to get packed away into our fat cells, among other places, but primarily we'll focus on that for right now. And at some point, the fat cells start saying, we can't take in any more, energy, any more sugar. Triglycerides are actually, the storage form, but they say, we're full, we can't take any more. And they basically stop responding to the insulin. And so the body the pancreas, which is kind of the center of trying to regulate our blood sugar, says, okay, we need to make more insulin because we got all this sugar now that's building up in our bloodstream. And so we're going to make even more insulin and try and keep shoving it into the into the fat cells. And one of my favorite analogies for this is, everyone's probably seen sort of the memes or the videos of, the trains in, India where they're just trying to shove, or Japan where they're trying to shove more and more people into the train cars. And there are actually people like, that their job is to just shove people into the train cars. That's basically what insulin is. And, the train cars are now full. There's no place else to shove people. So now, they start spilling out and the sugar starts spilling out into our bloodstream. And that's really, what causes the toxicity. And, that's a little bit of a simplistic explanation of it. It gets very complicated on a biochemical level, and it has lots of other effects. And one of the other interesting effects that happens with insulin resistance is it actually starts to change the types of cholesterol particles that are in our bloodstream. And it actually can lead to damage directly to the cholesterol particles, the cholesterol carrying particles, what we call lipoproteins, that then make them more sticky, essentially. And they can start to clump up into these plaques. So again, it's not that cholesterol has nothing to do with the development of heart disease. It's just that, it's not the cholesterol that starts the process. And it's really only the damaged cholesterol particles that take part in the process. So instead of just trying to blanket lower everyone's cholesterol level, what we really should be doing a better job of is figuring out who's got the damaged cholesterol particles that are causing the trouble. How can we prevent the cholesterol particles from being damaged in the first place? And that leads you right back to insulin resistance again. So that's why insulin resistance and metabolic health is such a powerful concept.
It's super interesting. I don't think I've ever heard it explained as simply and as easy to understand as that. So thank you for that. Want to kind of finish up on a couple of things in your book. And, there are a couple harder things for me because there's some foods in here that you do not recommend that are some of my favorites. And they seem to be okay in my keto diet. If I, look at my keto diet as being specifically, very low carb, which I probably ingest less than, 20 grams of carbs, probably less than 10 a day. And American cheese, I think you say something is like, might as well be eating plastic. Now, there's nothing better on a burger to me than a good slice of American cheese. So please tell me why American cheese is not something I should be eating.
Yeah. So, the problem with American cheese is it's a processed food. It was you can't like create American cheese in the same way that you create, like a good imported, mozzarella or brie cheese. The American cheese as we get it in, the supermarket typically is just another processed food. But I use that as an example of how to think about your food. Because, if you're going to the, package of, American cheese, it's all wrapped up in the plastic and it's sliced and wrapped up in the plastic. And, you flip that package over and you look at the ingredients. And again, what should be in cheese? Cheese should have milk and maybe some salt. And then, the bacteria that it takes, there really shouldn't be much in the way of an ingredient list on your cheese. But you look at that package of American cheese and you probably have 10 or 12 things listed, which include things like, coloring agents and, chemicals to help keep it shelf stable so it can be on, sitting in that supermarket for months or years at a time and still be, fresh when you buy it. And these are the problems that come with these processed foods. So, it's not that eating cheese is bad. And, it's not that I tell people not to eat cheese. But you do need to recognize that there's a difference between that packaged American cheese and, the good, imported, mozzarella cheese that you're going to get maybe someplace else in the supermarket.
Sure. So my next question on that would be, we can get pretty dogmatic when it comes to diets. And I think you even address this in your book. It almost becomes religious in some sense.
Right.
And so I think the question that I would have is, hey, if I love a really good slice of American cheese on a burger, is that okay? Is it one of those things that you would recommend I never have? I can have once in a while. I shouldn't be having it every day. Like, how do we, incorporate some of these things, into our lives that we really, really enjoy? Alcohol could probably be in there too. And my next one I want to talk to you about is my favorite not nightly snack, maybe biweekly snack is keto ice cream. So, so I'm looking at my sugars. I'm saying my sugars look great, so I'm sure I'm metabolically okay. But, you're telling me this is not stuff that you should be regularly putting in your body. Is that kind of safe to say should not be a regular occurrence?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. And I think it also is going to depend on where you're starting from and where you're trying to get to. Because, ultimately, like I said, this is why I try and get people to go back to those metabolic health metrics. If you are already metabolically unhealthy, any of these things that, are going to worsen that problem. And if you're trying to reverse the problem, unfortunately, you probably need to cut out, the vast majority. If you're metabolically healthy and, you can probably tolerate some of this stuff. But this is why it's so important to be looking at these metabolic health metrics, because if you're looking at something else, like your weight, as we mentioned before, you might get fooled. And you might be eating something that's causing your weight to go down or keeping your weight stable, but it's damaging your metabolic health. And that's going to be a problem down the line. And, this is similar to discussions we could have around finances. There are certain things that we do that from a financial standpoint, make no sense. You can go out to the fancy restaurant and, have the ribeye steak and, it's going to cost you $100, or you can, go buy the ribeye, for maybe $20 and cook it yourself. And, from a purely financial standpoint, you would say, well, you should never go out to the restaurant and get the $100 steak. But, from an enjoyment standpoint, from a life enjoyment standpoint, sometimes you make that sacrifice, but you recognize that it's a sacrifice. And that's how I want people to think about what they're eating as well. There are certain indulgences, we'll call them, that are clearly not going to be beneficial for your health. But, if you're making a conscious decision that, tonight, occasionally, whenever it is, I'm going to enjoy myself and have these foods, and you can regulate that properly and your metabolic health is staying good, great. But you know what? If you're already bouncing checks, then the answer is you can never go out to the fancy steak restaurant. And if you're already metabolically broken, then, the same thing is going to need to apply to your food. So one of the goals that I have with people, one of the goals I had in writing the book was to just get people to think about what they're eating. Because if you think about the ice cream and you decide I'm going to eat it tonight for whatever reason, I'm okay with that. But if you're just eating the ice cream because the ice cream is there and, you're eating it every night because the ice cream is there, that's when, we get into trouble with all of this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I recently in the last probably 9 months have stopped drinking the vast majority of alcohol. Because what was happening is I was getting home and I was saying, hey, I would love to just have a little something of bourbon. Bourbon is my drink of choice. And it became an every night occurrence. And I just drank it because it was there. And now I don't drink except when I'm on vacation, because one of the most soulful things for me is to have a drink with my wife on the beach or by the pool. And that's just a soulful, life-giving thing that I think is fine once in a while, right? So
Yeah.
it's all about the, like, not making it a regular occurrence. And I love your analogy of the financial. There are times when you can go out and have a great dinner and enjoy and celebrate, and there are times where you're like, okay, well, I shouldn't be going and getting that $100 steak at the restaurant. So I love that analogy. I got one quick question on that keto ice cream. Erythritol, I know that there was a study that came out that wasn't a good study. I think it's gotten debunked, but I've got questions around this. One is, to the extent you're familiar with the latest kind of studies on this stuff, erythritol is a sugar alcohol, so it has alcohol in its name. I'm just wondering if that alcohol impacts us the same way as our bourbon does. Meaning, when I have a bourbon right before I go to bed, I sleep like crap. I know it's going to happen. It's just a product of my decision. Is erythritol, does it act on our body the similar ways as other alcohols that we have, or what is the difference there?
Yeah, and I'm going to preface this by saying this is certainly not my area of expertise. But basically, what I focus on when it comes to this discussion is in your liver. It's basically getting processed the same way. So now, the getting drunk effect from alcohol, is a concentration issue. And the concentration of these sugar alcohols is vastly lower. So, we don't have that issue. But ultimately, alcohol is damaging to our livers. And these sugar alcohols seem to have, they get metabolized in the same way by the liver and can have the same effects. Mm-hmm. This is honestly a question that I struggle with these days, because if you are metabolically healthy, I would make the argument that if on that rare occasion you're going to decide to eat ice cream, you're probably better off getting an ice cream that's simply made and has natural ingredients. You can find ice creams that basically are made of cream, egg yolks, sugar, and vanilla, for instance, for a vanilla ice cream. And I would argue that that is probably a better occasional indulgence than the keto ice cream with all of these processed chemicals that, our bodies were not exposed to prior to 100 or 150 years ago. Sugar is something that has been in our environment forever. It was smaller amounts. It was harder to come by. But at least, our bodies know what sugar is. Our bodies were never exposed to sugar alcohols prior to, like I said, 100 years ago, maybe not even that long for sugar alcohols. And so our bodies don't know what to do with these things. And that's why I almost default to, you may be better off eating the small amounts of the real sugar than you are these sugar substitutes.
Yeah, good call. I have the opportunity to talk to a leading doctor in the world, and so I always have these questions that are rolling around in my head. So I have to take the opportunity to ask you some of these things. I will tell you, and maybe this is the higher being telling me something, is every time I have either a drink or erythritol with either ice cream or whatever it ends, I end up sleeping like garbage, which I know bad sleep leads to bad metabolic health as well. So,
yes, exactly.
Well, so I was going to be a guinea pig, knowing what you're probably going to tell me. But I wanted to actually have a real life example of labs and how you would look at labs. And I'll put them up on the screen here. But Dr. Ovadia, I've over the last, say, 6 months, I've done labs. I went to my primary care doc and said, just get me the labs that you recommend. And it was a pretty extensive, panel of labs. I think there were 8 or 10 in there. Most of them came back as okay. I think I had a couple high ones, like potassium was a little high. I'm on the keto diet, so ketones was high. And then, it said HDL was low, LDL was high, triglycerides were high, which you told us earlier in the podcast that if I have low HDL, I think mine were in the mid 20s. I should be in the 40s, I think you said, correct?
Yes, your HDL cholesterol, you want to be above 40.
And I'm in the
Ideally.
20s. My triglycerides were high. So I'm over. Those are my two metabolic health issues that I have. So my HDL is low, my triglycerides are high. So if you're thinking about a patient like me with low HDL, high triglycerides, I've been on the keto diet now for 9 months or maybe longer than that. Maybe it's my keto ice cream, but I have that, not that often, once every, week or two is my guess. Are there other things? I work out 3 times a week, sometimes 4. And just for the listeners, just to give you a sense, I'm 6'2", I'm 180 pounds, under 180 pounds. So it's I did do a DEXA scan. I don't have a lot of visceral fat, which is fat that kind of hangs out underneath the abdominal cavity, if that's correctly described. So not a lot of visceral fat. So I thought I was going to get these panels back, and I was going to be like, man, I'm going to be super stellar healthy, and it looks like I'm headed in the wrong direction. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so just some generalities about labs that I think are kind of relevant for your story as well, but will help people to understand some of the context. So the first thing is understand that the normal lab values that are reported are determined because that is the range that 95% of the population will fall within, the study population that was used for these studies. So, that are used to define the lab values. So basically, they take 100 supposedly healthy people, and I'll say, it's typically going to be 100 people without obvious health problems. But, in the context of this discussion, realize that a lot of those people probably do have some underlying issues that haven't been fully recognized. And they basically, look, what ranges that 95% of them are going to fall within. And that's what's defined as a normal value. That doesn't mean that value is optimal. It doesn't mean that your body is functioning optimally, at those certain levels. So you always want to keep that in mind. The other thing that's important is that these things change, and some of them change pretty quickly. And there are a lot of factors that can go into determining why they change. So, one lab test may not really be enough to give you all the answers. It's just a snapshot in time. And this is why I think it's important to look at trends over time. And when you're looking at one set of lab values and, maybe they're not perfect, you have to ask yourself, okay, are they getting better or are they getting worse? Because, someone like yourself who's maybe been doing whatever it is for a while, in this case, keto, but it can be anything. And then they get their labs. And if you don't know where you started from, because people don't check labs as often as I think we should, then it can become a little hard to interpret, because, your numbers may have looked a lot worse 6 months, a year ago. And yeah, they're not perfect, but if they're moving in the right direction, then we say, okay, you're probably doing something that's beneficial, and, you just need to keep doing it. Another important concept is that, these change, the damage to your metabolic health occurs over decades. And so someone who's metabolically unhealthy, things have been going on for decades. And while we see changes relatively quickly, we may not see 100% improvement all that quickly. And so it is a process. And so I always also try and get people not to get too frustrated if the numbers aren't going back to perfect, right away after a couple of months on a low carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet. But it should ultimately give you clues and should prompt you to keep, looking further if your numbers aren't getting to where they need to be. And, one other thing that we should certainly mention, we alluded to a couple of times, is that, while the food that you eat is the primary determinant of your metabolic health, it's not the only determinant of your metabolic health. And you do want to be thinking about the other determinants, like the activities that you're getting, the quality and amount of the sleep that you're getting, the stress, how you're dealing with the stress in your life, which is another factor that plays into
I run a
metabolic
startup.
health.
Maybe that has something to do with this.
Exactly. So, that's those are maybe some other areas that someone like yourself, where the numbers aren't quite where we want them to be, but it sounds like you're eating a pretty good diet. You can always dig in a little bit more on the diet, and you say maybe it's the keto ice cream and maybe it's the alcohol every once in a while, or there's something else in there that might be going on. But it could also be that, yeah, you know what, you are doing pretty good on the diet, but you're stressed out 24/7, and that's going to have its own effects. So these are the things that we can start looking at, and these are some of the clues that we can get at when we're reviewing blood work.
So two final questions on this. One is, if we have, maybe we can take these in two different ones. You said HDL was one of those risk factors, low HDL, and then high triglycerides.
Yep.
Is there something beyond nutrition that you would say specifically, let's just do low HDL first? Is that one where you say, okay, I need you in the gym more often, or I need you, what would you tell me as my doc to say, you got low HDL, here's the thing you need to be thinking about between now and say 6 months from now when you take this test again to see how we're doing?
Yeah, so building muscle is
Okay.
a big factor when it comes to HDL cholesterol. So that is certainly something that you want to pay attention to. The other thing to understand about HDL cholesterol is that it is somewhat genetically, bounded. So there are certainly people that run very high HDL levels genetically. There are other people that run low HDL levels genetically. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't influence it with your diet, with exercise, with other factors. It's just that, some people are never going to get to an HDL level of 100, no matter what they do. And other people, might have an HDL level of 100, even if they're not really, doing the right things. So again, that's where the historical lab work and tracking these things over time can be so powerful. The other point I was going to make there is that, that triglyceride to HDL ratio, which is so important, that has two components. So you can raise your HDL or you can lower your triglycerides. Ideally, you want to do both. And oftentimes the things that lead to, one of those occurring leads to both of those things occurring. So they usually do move, directionally together, meaning they both improve together. So, that's the good news that we can pay attention, that we can look at around that.
Well, you're talking about genetics, and I apologize for interrupting.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I showed my brother, who's 10 years older than me, a couple inches shorter, but similar stature, and his labs are almost exactly the same. His HDL is within a couple of points of mine. His triglycerides are within 10 points of mine, I think. I mean, they were eerily similar. And so my question then becomes, how much of this is genetic? By the way, my sister has high triglycerides as well, and she actually takes medication for high triglycerides.
Yeah.
And so can some of this stuff be genetic, or kind of what percentage of this? I know that's a hard question to answer, but like what is the genetic component of this that can move the needle on some of these numbers?
Yeah, so like I said, these things all do have some genetic, boundaries that we probably function within. Hard to assign a percentage to that, but you know, you can always improve your situation within maybe that genetic window that you're, locked into. And so, ultimately, what I try and get people to recognize regarding their genetics is it's not your destiny. And, you can always improve, even if maybe you were dealt, a little bit of a poor genetic hand. When we look at heart disease specifically, again, we have this concept that heart disease is a genetic disease, and your doctors will always tell you, oh, it runs in your family, or, there's nothing you can do about it. But you can do something about it. First of all, I think a lot of what we mistake as genetics being passed down through families is actually habits being passed down through families. And, we tend to share the same environment in our families. So, I think a lot of those effects get confused with genetic effects. And like I said, there are truly genetic diseases are very rare. Yes, they do occur, but they're pretty uncommon. Most of these things are genetically influenced, but they're also very much influenced by our environment and our habits. And so control what you can control. And, and I would say if you have been told, if it seems that heart disease runs in your family, that's even more reason to be paying attention to this stuff. That's how I view genetics.
Well, you talked about that in your book too, where you grew up in a family that had bad habits. And it sounds like everybody was overweight, and you just decided to stop that kind of generational habit forming eating disorder, if you will. And so, at what point did you kind of get to that place of saying, I'm going to stop this generational thing. I'm going to start eating right. Was there a point in time in your life that you said, this has got to change?
Well, honestly, it was when I, learned about metabolic health. That was the tool that allowed me to overcome, allowed me to make that change, because I had certainly tried other things before to change. I had tried to lose weight, and I, like many people, I had had the short-term successes that didn't last. But when I learned about metabolic health, that is what gave me the tools to make the sustainable changes. And that is what allowed me to overcome what I mistakenly thought was, my genetic destiny. And again, even, that is another example. I am not as lean as certainly other people are. You don't see me showing off my six pack on Twitter anytime. But I'm a lot better than I used to be. And I have, my metabolic health is optimal. I can say that those numbers, as well as a lot of other numbers that we can look at regarding metabolic health, are in the optimal ranges. But my percent body fat is still higher than, what a lot of people would consider ideal. Again, is that ultimately a genetic, issue? Or perhaps you could make the argument that, if I worked even harder, if I put in more time in the gym and maybe shifted around some of my dietary things, I might be able to get to the six pack. Getting back to our earlier part of the discussion, at some point you start to make trade-offs in your life. In order for me to spend, 3 or 4 hours a day in the gym, I would have to sacrifice other things in my life. And at this point, that's not what I choose to do. But again, these are intentional decisions that I make. And that's how I think people should be approaching this.
It's been super fun to hang out and learn more about metabolic health. And like I said, I had the opportunity, and it's not one that many people get, is to talk to, the preeminent or one of the preeminent heart surgeons in our country. And so I really appreciate you being willing to take all of my questions and just explaining them in a way that a numbskull like me can understand. So appreciate that about you. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So, the book, as you mentioned, Stay Off My Operating Table, it's widely available, all the usual places. iFix Hearts is the best place to find me. So you can go to ifixhearts.com. Right on the front page, by the way, we have a, free quiz that will take you through those metabolic health metrics, and you can determine if you are metabolically healthy or not. And I would encourage everyone to do that. We have coaching programs, and I also have a private medical telemedicine practice that I work with people throughout the United States to help them to stay off my operating table, to help them prevent heart disease and other chronic diseases. So all that information at ifixhearts.com. Over on social media, I'm most active on Twitter. And again, I'm at ifixhearts there on Twitter. You can also find me on Instagram, LinkedIn. I haven't dove into the TikTok pool quite yet. So, but anywhere else on social media, you can find me.
I would just say I'll follow you on Twitter and LinkedIn. iFix Hearts. It's a wealth of knowledge, and I learned something, I think, with every tweet. So I appreciate your willingness to give out free info like that. So, Dr. Philip Ovadia, thank you, sir, for being on the pod. It's really been fun.
This has been the Healthcare Liberty Lab. Thank you to our listeners and our sponsor, Crowd Health, for making this possible. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, be it Substack, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or somewhere else. We're glad to have you with us on this mission to rethink healthcare together.